The most challenging part for any yoga teacher is to create asana sequences. They would know how to teach asana, but they would find it difficult to sequence them in their class. It's like you have all the ingredients to make your favorite dish, but you don't have the recipe to cook it. Hello, yoga teachers and practitioners. My name is Neeraj Deshwal. I'm a yoga teacher trainer from Body Mind Alliance. On an average, a yoga teacher knows 70 to 80 asanas. And if we were to calculate the possible number of asana sequences that can be created from these asanas, the number would go in thousands and millions. But yet, most yoga teachers would struggle to create asana sequence. Let's understand why. Most yoga teachers, when they were doing their yoga teacher training course, they were doing limited sequences, and some of them would be doing the same sequence every day, and they would teach those sequences in their class. So their sequences are limited, and after some time they feel stuck. Then they would go on internet to find new sequences to put in their class. But most of the time these sequences don't work, because people have different bodies, they have different body requirement. One cannot simply copy paste these sequences into their class and expect them to work until you know how these sequences are created, until you have the right technique and the recipe to create these sequences. So this is exactly we are going to learn in this lesson. We are going to learn how to create yoga asana sequences. To create a good yoga sequence, you have to keep in mind three factors. Number one, purpose. What is the purpose of creating the sequence? What is the end result that you want to achieve by creating this sequence? So for example, you're making a sequence to improve hip mobility or spine mobility. If I'm making a sequence for hip mobility, I will first choose my asanas. So for example, I'll pick Supta Padangushta Asana, I'll pick Utthita Hasta Padangushta Asana, I may pick Warrior Pose 3 or Warrior Pose 2. And then based on our second factor, I will filter out these asanas. So what is our second factor? Second factor is people or the audience for whom we are creating this sequence. So this will define your audience or the people for whom you are creating this sequence. What level of practitioner they are, whether they are beginner or an experienced practitioner. So let's say there is a hip mobility sequence for beginner. Now I will pick Supta Padangushtasana because this asana has low difficulty level. I would not pick Utthita Hasta Padangushtasana for beginners. I will keep this asana for people who have some experience in practicing yoga. Now let's come to our third factor, which is the most important factor, which is criteria. Criteria is a standard by which something can be judged. So let me explain you with the help of an example. If you have a body temperature of 100°F, it is considered fever. In that case, you need to rest or take a pill. So what is the criteria? If the body temperature is greater than 98.9°F, it will be considered as fever. So this is exactly we are going to use to create our asana sequences. For us, the criteria is anatomy. The asana sequence that we are creating should make sense anatomically. Now we are going to assess a yoga asana sequence, and then we will understand how these sequences are created. After that, we are going to create new sequences from scratch. So let's assess our first yoga asana sequence. So this is the sequence that we are going to analyze. I have designed this sequence to work on duck feet walk. You may have seen people with their feet pointed out, and when they walk, it looks like a duck is walking. Now, because of this duck feet walk, People may have ankle pain, knee pain, pain in their hip joint, or sometimes they have pain in their lower back as well. So this sequence is aimed at solving duck feet issue. So we have clearly defined our purpose of designing this sequence. Now let's see for whom we are designing this sequence. This sequence is designed for beginners and people with some experience of practicing yoga. Now let's set a criteria for this sequence. So as I mentioned, our criteria is anatomy. And to set the criteria for this sequence, we need to understand why duck feet walk happens. Now there are three main reasons. Reason number one, limited internal rotation of the hip joint. Reason number two, limited ankle dorsiflexion. Reason number three, lack of pronation in the foot. So these are the three reasons because of which duck feet walk happens. So we are going to include asanas where we are going to practice internal rotation of the hip, where we are practicing dorsiflexion of the ankle, and where we are going to do the pronation of the foot. So our criteria is asana with internal rotation of hip, dorsiflexion in the ankle joint, and pronation of the foot. So let's analyze this sequence and see if this makes sense anatomically or not. So we begin with our first posture, which is Supta Padangusht Asana. Now, in this posture, the ankle goes into dorsiflexion. If you can see here, you bring the toes towards you and heels move away from you. So this brings the dorsiflexion in the ankle. We repeat this from both the sides. So we do it on right leg and then left leg. Now let's see what happens in the next posture, which is Adho Mukh Svanasana. Again, we are targeting the dorsiflexion of the ankle. So this will target your tibialis anterior muscle, again, which plays a key role in fixing your duck feet walk. Next asana is Tadasana because we are going to practice a standing posture, which is Uttanasana. So we will do next Uttanasana. Here we are using a block, in fact two blocks, and we keep the toes on the block and heels on the floor, and we are also using a chair. So as I mentioned, we are doing this for the beginner, so they would not be able to touch the floor or hold their ankle. So we use a chair here and we use two blocks. So why I am using block? Again, to work on the dorsiflexion of the ankle. And in this asana, hip goes in internal rotation. Now, let's see the next posture, which is Utkatasana. Here, again, we are using block and we keep the block between the thighs. The reason being, we want to work on the internal rotation of the hip and also the knee joint. So, again, we are fulfilling the criteria. We are working on the internal rotation of the hip. So people with duck feet, whenever they go in Utkatasana, they would tend to take their knees out and point their toes out because there is limited internal rotation in the hip joint. So again, we are working on this problem and training them to use the muscles which are doing the internal rotation of hip joint. Then we move on to Malasana. In Malasana, you may have seen people when they sit in Malasana, they lift their heels up and the toes point out. Again, this is a weakness in the tibialis anterior muscle. Now, if we see our first six posture, we are working on the dorsiflexion of the ankle. So this will help in Malasana as well. So this will somewhat activate your tibialis anterior muscle, and as you sit in Malasana, you will be in a much better position. So what you need to do here is when you are sitting in Malasana, you will practice not letting your toes go out, or when you are working with someone, when you are teaching someone, make sure they are not taking their toes out. They will train to control the movement of their foot. Now next, Virasana. In Virasana, hip rotates internally, and as you sit in Virasana, you do take your calves out and then sit. So this also rotates your knee internally. Again, these two movements are crucial to fix duck walk. Now, next is Adho Mukh Virasana. So there are two purposes we are fulfilling here because we are about to do Prasarit Padottanasana. This will stretch the muscles of the back, and then we are also working on the internal rotation of the hip. Now we will transition to the standing posture. So we will do Tadasana to ultimately do Prasarit Padottan Asana. As you can see in Prasarit Padottan Asana, hip goes in internal rotation, and this is somewhat a good posture to feel the internal rotation of the hip, and it is much easier to do than Uttanasana. Now from Prasarit Padottanasana you will come back to Tadasana and then you will do Garudasana. Again, Garudasana is a good asana to work on the internal rotation of the hip joint, and you will repeat this from right and left. Now from Garudasana, you will move on to Dandasana because we are preparing for next posture, which is Triangamukh Ekpad Paschimottan Asana. Now, if we see this posture, one leg is going in Virasana and one leg is in Dandasana. So the leg which is in Virasana, the hip is rotating internally, and on the left leg you are also working on the dorsiflexion of the ankle, and also we do the pronation of the foot here. So we do the eversion movement of your intertarsal joint. So we repeat this from both the side, right and left. Then we again come back to Dandasana, and then we do Paschim Uttan Asana. In Paschim Uttan Asana, we focus on the dorsiflexion of the ankle, also the pronation of the foot. So to do this asana properly, we need to pronate the foot or do the eversion movement of intertarsal joint. Now, next asana is Setu Bandhasana. Now, this asana will help you in the internal rotation to understand it and also to work on the pronation of the foot. So, people with duck feet walk, they would tend to take their foot out. So, when you practice Setu Bandhasana or teaching Setu Bandhasana, you can simply give a cue that press your big toe so that your knees are not pointing out, and one more cue to rotate the thighs out to in. So we are internally rotating the hip and doing the pronation of the foot. And then same is the case with Sarvang Asana. Both the asanas have the same benefit. We learn to do the internal rotation of the hip here, and we also do the pronation of the foot. In the end, to conclude the sequence, we do Shavasana or any resting posture. So we stay there for at least 2 to 3 minutes. So when we analyze this sequence, we have covered all the factors. We know the purpose. We have clearly defined for whom we are designing this sequence, and we have set the criteria, and we met the criteria throughout the sequence. So in this lesson, we learned how to make a good sequence, keeping in mind the 3 factors that we have talked about. Now in the upcoming lessons, we will learn more sequences, we will analyze more sequences, then we will design sequences from the scratch, keeping in mind those 3 factors. So that's all from this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.